Part II of George Frideric Handel by Herbert F. Peyser. This recording is in the public domain. Handel was not to leave Italy till some time during the late spring of 1710, yet there are not a few blanks in his Italian travels which it is impossible to fill out. He worked as industriously as ever; composed, played, absorbed myriad impressions. In Florence, Roderigo had a success which it was claimed by some had been achieved partly through the favor of the Grand Duke and the love of a prima donna, Vittoria Tarquini. Possibly it was furthered by the latter, but certainly not caused by it. Handel's life is conspicuously free from conventional love interest, and perhaps the most celebrated story of his dealings with women is the one which tells of his raging threat to throw the soprano Francesca Cuzzoni out of a window if she did not sing exactly as he wanted what he had written for her. Certainly the middle-aged Tarquini never attracted him physically. Encouraged by his Florentine luck, Handel was moved to try his fortunes in Venice, where opera houses had sprung up everywhere and at one time numbered 15. 7 were playing on one and the same evening during carnival time, and there were musical diversions or solemnities of one sort or another in churches and in those women's conservatories called hospitals. Venice was then the musical capital of Italy, somewhat as Milan was to become at a later date. Handel does not appear to have contributed to the operatic life of the city at this time, but his chance was to come before long. Yet he did make one encounter in Venice which was to have consequences. He met Ernest Augustus, Prince of Hanover, and the Duke of Manchester, English Ambassador Extraordinary. He went back to Rome, where an unsuccessful attempt was made to convert him to Catholicism. Yet he loved the city, and regretfully tore himself away from it to make a jaunt to Naples, which contributed importantly to his artistic sensibilities. As he had done elsewhere in Italy, he haunted the picture galleries and nourished his enthusiasm for paintings. He assimilated the Spanish and French musical styles, which fought for honors in this city, saw much of Alessandro Scarlatti, interested himself in the folk music of the place, noted down the melodies of the Calabrian Pifferari, met the Venetian Cardinal Grimani, composed for the Neapolitan Arcadians the Serenata a Cis and Galatea. Grimani, whose family owned the theatre of San Giovanni Crisostomo in Venice, supplied him with the libretto of an opera, Agrippina, which Handel probably began to compose on the spot. Its performance in Venice was as good as assured, and from Naples he returned to Rome, making another useful friend in the Bishop Agostino Steffani, who was charged with secret missions by different German princes and held at the same time the post of Kapellmeister at the court of Hanover. Agrippina was produced in Venice 1709–10. Its reception exceeded anything the composer had known till then. The chronicles tell of cries of "Viva el caro Sasson!", also of extravagances impossible to record. Obviously his travels in the peninsula had superbly enriched his creative powers, and the Venetians found the new work the most melodious of Handel's Italian operas. Nor was his popularity confined to Venice. He seems to have had some idea of going to Paris, became familiar with the French language, used it in his correspondence, and Romain Rolland describes his style as "always very correct and having the fine courtesy of the court of Louis XIV." But Handel did not go to France. Instead he returned to Germany and went to Hanover. Prince Ernest had, in Venice, been completely captivated by Agrippina, and repeated an invitation he had made once before. The worthy Steffani invited the "dear Saxon" to succeed him as Kapellmeister at the Hanoverian court. Wisely the "dear Saxon" accepted. How differently things might have turned out had he not been in Venice at just that providential moment! So Handel, as Crisander said, walked in the steps of Steffani, but his feet were larger. His stay in Hanover in 1710 was brief. Hardly had he prepared to take up his duties than proposals were made to him from England. He asked leave of absence and received it, accepted an invitation from the Elector Johann Wilhelm to visit his court at Düsseldorf, and then by way of Holland traveled to London, which he reached late in 1710, unable to speak a word of English. Before he had gone back to the Hanoverian court he had written an opera, produced it amid prodigious enthusiasm, and taken the first steps toward becoming a sovereign British institution. He could not have timed his coming better. Purcell's death 16 years earlier had given what was something like a death blow to English music, and what now passed for native compositions amounted to pitiable odds and ends. Rolland ridicules the claim of some unthinking people that Handel "killed English music since there was nothing left to kill." A renewal of the puritanical opposition which poisoned the English stage contributed to the confusion and discouragement of British artists, and the worst of such attacks as the notorious Jeremy Collier had made on the profaneness and immorality of the theatre lay in the fact that, as such things often do, they express the deep feelings of the nation. In consequence of a universal hypocrisy, foreign elements came to fill the vacuum created. Some bad Italian librettos were set to wretched music and served up with momentary success. Other "entertainments" of the sort mingled Italian and English words and were duly satirized by the jealous and priggish Joseph Addison, nettled by the failure of his own piece Rosamund, to which one Thomas Clayton had composed atrocious music. Handel came into contact with one Aaron Hill, who managed the Queen's Theatre in the Haymarket, and received from him an opera text Rinaldo, which an Italian, Giacomo Rossi, had adapted from Tasso's Jerusalem Delivered. The new arrival rose magnificently to his opportunity. The music was completed in just 2 weeks and performed on February 24, 1711. And luck aided Handel by supplying him with some extraordinary singers, all of them new to England: Giuseppe Boschi, a young and astounding bass, and the sensational castrato Nicolini, who took London by storm. The tale of Rinaldo was that of the Venetian Agrippina all over again. In one evening the British capital was subjugated. For all the bile and venom Addison and Steele could discharge into the columns of the Spectator and the Tatler. The melodies of the opera spread like wildfire and seem to have appealed to the lower classes as well as to the aristocracy. To this day some of them have preserved their vitality. The noble air "Lascia ch'io pianga" in saraband rhythm is a fairly familiar item on recital programs, and the Crusaders' March, a fine swinging tune, was adapted to the words "Let us take the road" by Dr. Pepusch when he assembled out of countless folk songs and dances John Gay's deathless Beggar's Opera, in 1728 a thorn in Handel's side, but still, after more than 2 centuries, a classic with an iron constitution. Roughly speaking, Handel composed 44 operas from Almira in 1705 at Hamburg to Diadema (1741) in London. It is obviously impossible to consider even a small fraction of them here, and we shall have to content ourselves with little more than the names and dates of only a few. All the same, it may be well to pause here momentarily to ask ourselves what, in the first place, a Handel opera really is like. For unless we are specialists, not to say antiquarians, we have little means of definitely knowing. The lyric drama of that period cannot be judged by the works of the 19th and 20th centuries, or even by more than a scant handful of masterpieces of Gluck and Mozart. Its problems, its musical and dramatic aspects, are basically different. A movement, which had its rise in Germany after the First World War, and which continued on and off for several years, even spreading intermittently to other countries, including the United States, demonstrated that these Baroque entertainments are essentially museum pieces, prizable as certain of their elements may be. To us, who have been nurtured on the theatre works of Mozart, of the composers of the school of dramatic and pictorial grand opera, of the opera buffa and the opera comique, the drama lyrique of Gounod and Bizet, the works of Verdi, the music dramas of Wagner and his assorted successors of various nationalities, to us the operatic specimens of Handel seem infinitely alien and remote in their premises and calculated stylizations. The nearest we can approach them today is through such surviving examples of the old opera seria as Mozart's Idomeneo or Gluck's Alceste, and even those do not supply genuine parallels. To the average person reared on the lyric drama as known to 2 or 3 generations preceding ours, the long-established description of a Handelian opera as a concert in costume may suffice at a pinch. But in a larger sense it begs the question, for Handel's 40-odd operas are both more than this and less. We should find their librettos so cut to a pattern that the most old-fashioned books of the 19th century would possibly strike us, by comparison, dramatically bold, even involved. Handelian operas have no trace of psychological subtlety or elementary conflict. What theatrical action there is passes before us with something like lightning speed. Incidents which need to be communicated to the spectator are in the main recounted in recitative. What we understand as incident is subordinate to phases of emotional expression, and in ensemble pieces. Joy, rage, sadness, a broad scale of elemental feelings, are recognizably embodied in musical moods and tempos unmistakable in their lyrical or dramatic communications of affetti, emotions. There is little, if indeed any, of what a later aesthetic was to call the art of transition, and it was nothing in any manner unusual for a fiery or combative presto to precede or follow a tender largo or andante, and other formalistic clichés. The accompaniment, the orchestra, indeed the action and the stage picture, is not much more than incidental background and frame. The true center of gravity of a Handel opera lies in the performance of the singers and their command of declamation, florid utterance, sustained song, and artifices at that epoch accepted as supremely expressive. Only in grasping these facts can we put ourselves in the frame of mind needed to understand the essential principles of these Baroque masterpieces, and to appreciate what, apart from their sheer melodic beauties, lifts them to a higher level than curios lacking any further validity, difficult as it may be for many of us to force our imagination and our feelings into such a mold. Having conquered England at a blow and become the idol not only of high society but of the common people as well, Handel recalled in the spring of 1711 that he was still Kapellmeister of Hanover. In London he had made enemies as well as friends, and one of the most implacable of his foes was the great but churlish Addison. His admirers, on the other hand, included a child named Mary Granville, later Mrs. Delany, one of his staunchest friends; the Duke of Burlington, through whom he had entrée to Burlington House; and the famous eccentric Thomas Britton, a coal dealer by day, but who, on certain evenings, sponsored memorable concerts in a specially outfitted loft above his coal shop, which drew prominent London musicians and cultured aristocrats to the Clerkenwell garret, where Handel frequently appeared as harpsichord and even organ virtuoso. Back in Hanover, June, 1711, he renewed his contacts with Bishop Stephani, composed organ concertos and other chamber music, as well as a quantity of songs to German texts by the Hamburg senator Brooks. He would have liked to produce Rinaldo, but the Hanover Opera was closed. Yet London had entered his blood, and nothing would content him but his speedy return, the more so because his English admirers demanded him. He obtained leave, on condition that he return to Hanover after a reasonable time, and by November, 1712, he arrived in England to supervise preparations for a pastoral, Il Pastor Fido, a work hastily thrown together and variously improved more than 20 years later. This time Handel did not repeat his Rinaldo sensation, and the piece had only half a dozen hearings. To make matters worse, a certain McSwiney, who succeeded Aaron Hill at the Queen's Theatre, absconded, leaving nothing but unpaid bills and enraged singers. At this stage there enters the picture a Swiss adventurer, by name Heidegger, a man of unbelievable conceit and homeliness, who was, however, to play an important role in Handel's future. To recoup the failure of Il Pastor Fido, the composer turned out in less than 3 weeks a tragic opera in 5 acts, Teseo, with a libretto by Niccolo Francesco Haim, and dedicated tactfully to the Earl of Burlington. Teseo came near duplicating the fortunes of Rinaldo, and if, as Roland says, it was full of haste, it was also full of genius. If anything could have entrenched the composer still more firmly in London, it was this opera. He went for a while to live at Burlington House at the Duke's invitation; met Pope, Gay, Arbuthnot, struck up friendships with this and that musician at the Queen's Arms Tavern in St. Paul's Churchyard, and was never so happy as when he sat with some musical crony, a mug of beer at hand and a harpsichord near by. The first work he composed in the ideal peace of Burlington House was a birthday ode for Queen Anne, whom he had met on his first London visit. The ode was produced at St. James's on February 6, 1713, and was the first English he had set to music. All his life Handel's English remained bad, sometimes even grotesque, and the incorrect accenting in his compositions repeatedly betray his deficiency in our tongue. Of such faults the Birthday Ode had its full share, in spite of which the Queen was so delighted with the work that she settled on the composer an annual pension of £200. He found it politic to write music for patriotic purposes, and instantly complied with the sovereign's command to supply a Te Deum and a Jubilate to celebrate the Peace of Utrecht, both compositions given at a solemn service at St. Paul's before the assembled members of Parliament. Queen Anne died on August 1, 1714, and for a time the skies over Handel threatened to cloud; for on the very day of her passing the Elector of Hanover was proclaimed by the Secret Council King of England. He arrived in London on September 20 and was crowned George I at Westminster a month later. Here was a pretty kettle of fish! His former master, to whose service he had most certainly not returned in a reasonable time, suddenly seated on the English throne, and not even a new Te Deum prepared against his coming to the land which Handel now regarded as home. Handelian luck got him out of what might have been a serious predicament. He must have trusted to his destiny in the first place to help him out of an obviously awkward situation, and being tactful he made no open move to aggravate it. George I was and remained intensely German, brought to England with him a compact body of Germans, chamberlains, secretaries, even his pair of elderly mistresses, the Baroness Kielmansegge and Madame Schulenburg, and all manner of comforts and consolations he could not find in his new island kingdom. He made no effort to shed his German love of music, wherefore, as Roland points out, he could not punish Handel without punishing himself. And after he heard Handel's fascinating new opera Amadigi in May, 1715, he lost all idea, if indeed he ever harbored any, of disciplining his former servant. He appointed Handel music master to the little princesses, and when, in 1716, the monarch had to go to Hanover, the composer accompanied him on the trip, took occasion to study musical developments in Germany, and even wrote a Passion on a text by Heinrich Brockes. Here is the point to consider for a moment, the tale of the water music, one of the most venerable Handelian anecdotes. The story runs somewhat as follows. Lord Burlington and Baron Kielmansegge, the master of the King's Horse, in order to reconcile sovereign and musician in 1715, persuaded the latter to write a set of light pieces to be played on a boat close to the royal barge at a water party on the Thames. The King liked the music sufficiently to inquire who composed it, and being told, summoned Handel, promised to let bygones be bygones, and received him back into favor. Unfortunately for romance, later documents have shown that the water music was not played till 1717, and then under wholly different conditions. But the legend has become so ingrained in British musical tradition that, as Newman Flower wrote, it is precisely what ought to have happened. At all events, the water music is an adorable suite, definitely English in character, like much else in Handel's music, and to this day an ornament of concert programs in one or another arrangement. King George, far from remembering past annoyances, saw to it that Handel's yearly pension from Queen Anne should be increased to £600, so that even without further earnings his financial state was tolerably secure. His good fortunes were enhanced by the musical enthusiasms of the King, who could not hear enough of Rinaldo and Amadigi, to the spectacular features of which live birds, which sometimes misbehaved, and a fountain of real water heightened the attraction of sumptuous settings. He went to them, often incognito, several times a week, sharing his private box with his bevy of lady friends, new and old. Or he would vary his visits to the opera with attendance at plays or concerts, so that his chances to admire the works of Handel in one form or another were rarely lacking. Many found that the monarch's habit of parading his amours before London audiences added to the piquancy of a Handelian score. By the side of the famed artificial soprano Nicolini sang the brilliant Anastasia Robinson, who had been a soprano but whose voice, after a siege of illness, suddenly dropped to contralto. Mrs. Robinson was particularly noted for the fact that her morals were at all times spotless. Mrs. Delany was to describe her as of middling stature, not handsome, but of a pleasing, modest countenance, with large blue eyes. Her manner and address were very engaging, and her behavior on all occasions that of a gentlewoman. When her husband, Lord Peterborough, died, she burned the diaries he had kept, wherein he had noted his various infidelities and other secrets not meant for the scrutiny of his wife. Handel's star was steadily rising, and his fame was not to be transcended till a number of years later, and then only by virtue of his own genius and after many fluctuations of fortune. But when the King returned to London from his trip to Germany, opera fell upon bad days. Musical and theatrical life flourished, indeed, yet suddenly farces and other diversions imported from France captured the mood of the town and delighted the monarch and his ladies. Now nobody felt like putting up money on opera, since inexpensive vulgarity was a safer bet. At just about this period Handel and James Brydges, Duke of Chandos, former Paymaster General of the army during the Marlborough Wars, were brought into contact. The erstwhile Earl of Carnarvon had accumulated his wealth by heaven knows what sharp practices, and inherited an estate at Cannons near Edgware, where he had erected a luxurious palace, including a chapel, a theatre, and other musical appurtenances inseparable from such an establishment. The Prince of Wales was a frequent visitor at Cannons, braving even the swarming footpads of Edgware Road. The Duke of Chandos seems to have been in a position to buy anything which struck his fancy, and there is a story that on one occasion he or his son, the accounts differ, coming across a man unmercifully thrashing his well-favored wife, rescued the lady by buying her on the spot. He therefore had no particular trouble securing Handel as master of his music in place of his former employee, the German Dr. Pepusch. Some 10 years later Dr. Pepusch had his revenge by compiling the score of the Beggar's Opera, which was to become such a grievous obstacle in Handel's path. But until 1720 Handel was in the service of the Duke of Chandos, even if he spent much of his time in London, busily attending to the musical instruction of the daughters of Caroline, Princess of Wales, and writing numerous lessons and clavier suites for his royal pupils. Which brings us to another celebrated Handelian fiction, The Harmonious Blacksmith. The legend is quite as diversified and even more far-fetched than the one about the water music. For well over a century the world has been fed the story of the blacksmith and his forge near Whitchurch, close to Edgware. In the house of this blacksmith Handel is supposed to have taken refuge from a thunderstorm, the blacksmith meantime continuing his hammering. When the storm was over the composer went forth, and still haunted by the rhythm of the pounding, set down the melody and then proceeded to write variations on it. This air and variations form part of Handel's fifth suite of clavecin pieces, but it was not until 1820 that some imaginative publisher, taking his cue from an apprentice who continually whistled Handel's tune, invented the fanciful title. And not until 1835 that the London Times published an anonymous letter retailing the legend of the blacksmith and his forge. We have no place here to recount the complex ramifications of the amiable myth which culminated in the auctioning off of an old anvil, supposedly the very one which the composer heard struck. But the publisher had the last word, and to the end of time the fifth suite will assuredly remain The Harmonious Blacksmith. Far more important in the development of Handel's style are the Chandos anthems, or psalms, composed during the years from 1717 to 1720, while the master at Cannons was steadily evolving. They fill 3 volumes of the complete Handel edition, and stand in relationship to Handel's oratorios in the same position as his Italian cantatas stand to his operas. In these religious cantatas, written for the Duke's chapel, Handel gives the first place to the chorus. There is already in them the spirit and the style of Israel in Egypt, the great monumental lines, the popular feeling. It was only a step from this to the colossal biblical dramas, Roland, and Handel took the first step with Esther, called in its first form Haman and Mordecai, a Masque. It was staged on August 29, 1720. Almost simultaneously he wrote the exquisite pastoral tragedy Acis and Galatea, a Sicilian legend he had already treated during his Neapolitan days, but which in its later shape took on an insurpassable element of classical finish. End of Part 2.